3 weeks ago, something shifted in the way Israel's war cabinet is talking about what comes after. Not in a press conference, not in a formal policy address, but in the specific language a senior Israeli official used in a closed briefing with 3 European foreign ministers, language that leaked quietly into 2 separate diplomatic cables that made their way to desks in Brussels and Ottawa within 48 hours. The word he used was permanent, not temporary buffer zone, not transitional administration, not phase withdrawal, permanent. And when you follow that single word all the way through the military positioning happening right now in northern Gaza, through the settlement expansion announcements that barely made the international press, through the budget allocations the Knesset approved in a late-night session 2 Tuesdays ago, the picture that emerges is fundamentally different from the one most coverage is giving you. This is not a story about whether the war ends. It is a story about what Israel is quietly building while the world debates the ceasefire terms. And the gap between those 2 conversations is where the real endgame lives. What Netanyahu actually wants when this war concludes is not what he is saying publicly. It is not what his American partners are being told in formal settings. And it is not what the humanitarian corridors discussion is designed to make you focus on. It is something more specific, more structurally ambitious, and more consequential for the next 50 years of Middle Eastern geography than almost anything being said at the podium level. To understand it, you have to go back further than October 7th. You have to go back to a document, a map, and a speech that most international observers noted briefly and then filed away as political theater. It was not theater. It was a blueprint. And the military operation, now in its 19th month, is the mechanism for implementing it. Let us start with where the troops actually are right now, because the operational reality on the ground tells a story that the diplomatic conversation is carefully avoiding. As of this week, the Israeli Defense Forces maintain what military analysts are describing as a tripartite control structure across Gaza. In the north, the Netzarim corridor, a military road cutting horizontally across the strip, has been expanded 3 times since it was first established. It is now wide enough, according to satellite imagery analyzed by 2 independent research groups, to function not as a temporary military position but as a permanent administrative boundary. The infrastructure being constructed along hardened positions, communication towers, supply route reinforcements, does not look like the infrastructure of an army preparing to leave. In the south, the Philadelphia corridor along the Egyptian border, which Israel initially described as a temporary security measure, has now been fortified to a degree that Egyptian officials are describing in private communications as a unilateral redrawing of the functional border. Cairo has lodged 3 formal complaints through back channels. None of them have produced any visible change in the construction pace, and in the center, in what used to be Gaza City, the pattern of demolition is not random. Independent urban analysis teams working from satellite data have documented a specific geometry to what has been cleared and what has been left standing. The clearance lines correspond with striking precision to zoning maps that appeared in Israeli far-right political literature as recently as 2022. Maps that propose the establishment of Israeli civilian communities in northern Gaza. None of this is secret. All of it is documented. Almost none of it is being discussed in the terms it deserves in mainstream diplomatic coverage, because discussing it in those terms requires acknowledging something that Western governments are not yet prepared to say officially, that the stated goal of eliminating Hamas and the operational reality being created on the ground are not the same project. To understand Netanyahu specifically, not the war cabinet collectively, not the IDF command structure, but Netanyahu as a political actor with his own survival calculus. You have to understand the corner he is standing in. Domestically, he is currently the subject of an active corruption trial that has been running for 4 years. 3 separate cases, charges including fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. The trial has continued through the war, with Netanyahu's legal team repeatedly seeking delays on grounds of wartime necessity. Those delays have been partially granted, partially denied, and the proceedings are expected to reach their most consequential phase within the next 8 months. A sitting prime minister convicted of corruption in Israel does not automatically leave office, but the political conditions that follow a conviction make governance functionally impossible, which means Netanyahu's personal timeline, his legal survival, is operating in parallel with his political and military decision-making in a way that serious analysts inside Israel are no longer treating as separate variables. His governing coalition is the most right-wing in Israeli history. It includes ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich specifically, who have stated explicitly on record that they believe the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank is not only acceptable but necessary and desirable. Ben-Gvir resigned temporarily from the cabinet when a ceasefire deal was announced, returned when it collapsed, and has made clear that any agreement that does not end with Israeli control over Gaza territory is, in his framing, a betrayal. Netanyahu needs those ministers to stay in his coalition. Without them, his government falls. Without his government, his ability to manage the legal proceedings against him, including the timing of testimony and the political pressure on the judiciary, diminishes significantly. So when you try to understand what Netanyahu wants from this war's conclusion, you cannot analyze it purely as strategic military policy. You have to analyze it as the output of a man who needs a specific domestic political outcome to survive, governing through partners who have attached their continued participation in government to a specific territorial result. That combination produces a very particular kind of endgame logic, and it is playing out in real time. The settlement expansion piece is where the logic becomes most visible and most measurable. Since October 7th, settlement construction in the West Bank has accelerated at a pace that Israeli human rights organizations are describing as the fastest in 30 years. The specific number, 24,000 new housing units approved or under construction in the 12 months following the start of the war. In geographic terms, the expansion has been concentrated in areas that, under any proposed two-state framework, would fall inside a future Palestinian state. The timing is not coincidental. It is a documented pattern. Historical analysis of Israeli settlement expansion shows that it accelerates during periods of regional conflict, when international attention is focused on active military operations and the diplomatic cost of settlement announcements is temporarily lowered. The current expansion is following that pattern at scale. Smotrich, who serves simultaneously as finance minister and as a minister with authority over civilian settlement administration in the West Bank, has been explicit about the strategic logic. He said in a recorded address to settlers in March that the current moment is a historic opportunity that will not repeat, and that the physical facts being established on the ground now will determine the political facts available for negotiation for the next generation. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was describing policy. The connection to Gaza is direct. The argument being made inside the Israeli right, stated openly in some forums, implied in official policy and others, is that the permanent removal of Hamas from Gaza, combined with accelerated settlement consolidation in the West Bank, creates a physical and political reality in which a contiguous Palestinian state becomes territorially impossible, not politically difficult. Territorially impossible, that is the endgame being constructed, not articulated at the podium level, not handed to American negotiators in formal briefings, but legible in every land allocation decision, every infrastructure contract, every military positioning choice being made right now. The American relationship with all of this is where the picture becomes most complicated and most consequential for anyone trying to understand where this actually goes. The Biden administration spent 18 months applying what it described as private pressure on Netanyahu over civilian casualties, humanitarian access, and the need for a credible path toward Palestinian governance post-war. The results of that private pressure, as documented by the officials who conducted it, were negligible. Netanyahu's government absorbed the pressure, issued minimal public acknowledgments, and continued the military campaign on its own operational timeline. The current administration has taken a different approach. It has provided significantly fewer conditions attached to military support, pulled back from the language of a two-state solution as an active near-term policy goal, and elevated the Abraham Accords framework normalization between Israel and Arab states as the organizing diplomatic concept for the region. The Abraham Accords framework, whatever its genuine merits, has a structural feature that matters enormously in this context. It does not require Palestinian consent. It does not require Palestinian statehood as a precondition. It creates Israeli normalization with Arab governments over and around the Palestinian issue, rather than through its resolution. For Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords framework is not just a diplomatic achievement, it is a containment mechanism. If Israel can normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, the prize that has been dangled and withdrawn repeatedly for 2 years, it achieves a level of regional legitimacy that makes the Palestinian question politically manageable indefinitely, not resolved. managed, set aside under layers of economic and security cooperation that give Arab governments sufficient domestic cover to participate. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has its own conditions. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been explicit, at least in formal diplomatic settings, that normalization requires some credible pathway toward Palestinian statehood. The specific demand has shifted in its urgency depending on the level of violence in Gaza in any given week, but it has not disappeared, which creates the central tension in the current American diplomatic push. The administration wants the Saudi normalization deal. Netanyahu wants the Saudi normalization deal. But Netanyahu's governing coalition will collapse if the Palestinian pathway required by Riyadh is made credible and binding. And so the negotiation proceeds through an elaborate architecture of ambiguity language carefully chosen to allow each party to tell its own domestic audience what it needs to hear without any of it being locked down in terms that require implementation. The question is how long that architecture holds. And the answer, based on what is being built on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank right now, is that it is being deliberately undermined at the physical level, even while it is being sustained at the rhetorical level. By the time the diplomatic conversation is forced to confront the territorial reality, the territorial reality will have been significantly altered. The European reading of all this is where the diplomatic pressure is building most visibly. Even if it has not yet produced consequences that match its rhetoric, the International Court of Justice provisional ruling issued in January 2024 found plausible grounds for the genocide case brought by South Africa and ordered Israel to take immediate measures to prevent acts that could fall under the Genocide Convention. That ruling has not been enforced. It has not produced sanctions, but it has changed the legal landscape in which European foreign ministers operate in a way that is gradually, unevenly, but measurably shifting the diplomatic calculus. Belgium has suspended arms exports to Israel. Spain and Ireland formally recognized Palestinian statehood. The United Kingdom imposed limited sanctions on specific settler groups operating in the West Bank. None of these actions individually changes anything on the ground. Collectively, they represent a fragmentation of the Western consensus that has historically provided Israel with the diplomatic cover to conduct extended military operations without formal international accountability mechanisms being triggered. The fragmentation matters because it is directional. Each European government that moves even partially, even symbolically, makes it easier for the next one to move further. The floor is dropping, and the question being asked in foreign ministries from Paris to The Hague is not whether Israel's conduct meets a legal threshold for accountability, but whether their own domestic politics will eventually require them to act as if it does, regardless of what Washington says. Netanyahu's calculation has always been that European rhetoric does not translate into consequences that alter the strategic equation. That calculation has been largely correct for decades. The current evidence suggests it is becoming less correct. Not wrong yet, but less correct in a way that compounds over time. There is also a piece of this story that almost no major outlet is telling with the specificity it deserves. It is the internal Israeli conversation, not the cabinet, not the far right, but the security establishment, the former military chiefs, the intelligence officials who have spent careers thinking about Israeli strategic interests in terms that extend beyond the current government's political survival. That community, represented in public by figures like former Mossad chief Tamir Pardo and former IDF chief of staff Moshe Yaalon, has been saying something in Israeli public discourse that is not making it into most international coverage. They are saying the current strategy does not have an endgame that produces Israeli security. They are saying the absence of any credible Palestinian governance structure in Gaza after Hamas means the military will be managing the Strip indefinitely, at enormous human and financial cost, without a political horizon that changes the underlying conditions. They are saying the settlement expansion in the West Bank is not making Israel more secure. It is making the one-state reality, which the Israeli security establishment has historically viewed as an existential demographic threat, more likely, not less. These are not left-wing voices in the Israeli context. These are former chiefs of the institutions that have conducted Israeli security policy for generations. And they are describing the current trajectory not as a path to victory, but as a path to a trap. Netanyahu's response to that critique, delivered indirectly through allies and spokespeople, has been consistent. He frames his critics as people who do not understand the new post-October 7th reality. He argues that the old strategic assumptions that guided the Oslo generation of Israeli security thinking have been proven catastrophically wrong. He presents the current course as the only honest reckoning with what Palestinian statehood in practice has actually produced. That is a politically powerful argument inside Israel. It is not a strategic endgame. It is a description of what the current government is against, what it is for what Israel looks like in 10 years under this trajectory, what the Gaza Strip looks like, what the West Bank looks like, what the relationship with Jordan and Egypt looks like under sustained displacement pressure. None of that is being articulated with any clarity, because articulating it clearly would require acknowledging publicly what the ground-level construction is already revealing. Watch 3 things in the coming weeks. They will tell you more about where this actually goes than any formal statement coming out of Jerusalem or Washington. Watch the Rafah crossing. The pace and permanence of the infrastructure being built on the Israeli-controlled side of that crossing is the clearest physical indicator of whether Gaza is being administered as a temporary military zone or a permanent territorial acquisition. Temporary military zones do not get fiber optic cable laid. They do not get permanent water infrastructure on the controlling side. Watch what gets built there and what the construction timeline looks like. Watch the Saudi negotiations specifically, whether the Palestinian statehood language in any proposed normalization framework gets more specific or more vague over the next 60 days. If it gets more vague, it means Riyadh has decided the economic and security benefits of normalization outweigh the domestic political cost of abandoning the Palestinian issue in any meaningful sense. That would be the most significant diplomatic development in the region in 20 years and would remove the last significant external break on the territorial consolidation currently underway. Watch the Israeli budget. The Knesset's allocation decisions for civilian infrastructure in Gaza and the administrative structures being funded inside the West Bank are the financial fingerprint of the actual policy, not the policy as described in press statements. The policy as funded. Budget lines do not lie the way podium statements do. When money moves toward permanent civilian infrastructure in occupied territory, it tells you what the government believes the long-term status of that territory is going to be. The endgame Netanyahu is pursuing is not hidden. It is legible in the construction contracts, the budget allocations, the coalition arithmetic, the specific legal exposure that makes his personal political survival dependent on a particular outcome, and the systematic elimination of the territorial conditions that would make a Palestinian state physically viable. It is a strategy of permanent facts. The logic is that if enough physical reality is established on the ground, enough settlements, enough cleared land, enough Israeli administrative infrastructure, enough normalized Arab relationships built over and around the Palestinian question, the international community will eventually accept the new geography the way it has accepted other territorial realities that were created through force and consolidated through time. That strategy has worked before in different contexts. It has produced the map of the modern Middle East. It has produced borders across the world that were drawn through displacement and consolidated through decades of physical reality outlasting international objection. Whether it works this time depends on whether the international fragmentation currently visible in European capitals accelerates to the point of producing real consequences, whether the American political environment shifts in a direction that forces a different set of conditions onto the bilateral relationship, whether the Saudi normalization calculation changes, and whether the internal Israeli security establishment's critique of the trajectory gains enough political weight to alter the coalition arithmetic. None of those things are guaranteed. None of them are impossible. All of them are in motion right now. The war is being discussed as if it is heading toward a conclusion. The territorial project being conducted beneath the war is being built for permanence. And the gap between those two realities, the ceasefire conversation and the construction timeline, is the space in which the actual future of this conflict is being decided, not in the negotiating rooms, on the ground, in the geometry of what is being built, and where, and with what materials, and on what legal classification of land. Watch the blueprints. They are more honest than the briefings, and that is the landscape as it stands tonight, unresolved, still accelerating, and clearer than it has been at any point in this war once you look at what is being built rather than what is being said. If the kind of analysis that connects those threads is what brings you here, take a moment to hit the like button. It is how this perspective reaches the people who need it. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next development in this story is not weeks away. Based on the construction pace, the coalition calendar, and the Saudi negotiation timeline, it is days the blueprints are already drawn. The question is whether anyone with the power to matter is reading them.